Hello, and welcome to a panel entitled Russia in Africa, Soviet Legacies, Current Objectives, and Local Responses. I'm Elise Giuliano, a professor of political science here at Harriman Institute at Columbia University, and the director of the program on U.S. Russian Relations. Our panel today is co-sponsored by the Institute of African Studies at Columbia University, and it is funded by a grant from Carnegie Foundation. We are happy that you could join us for what promises to be a very timely and important discussion about Russia's recent engagement in Africa. Maybe not so recent. We will also hear about the Soviet history of engagement on the continent. But the bulk of the panel will really focus on Russia's relations with various countries over the past several years. And we ask the broad question, what is behind Russia's so-called return to Africa? And we will consider this question from the point of view of Russia's motivations and also from the point of view of what the local response has been in terms of the interests of local actors, as well as the effect that Russia's interventions have had on local populations in a variety of countries. I'm very happy to welcome three interesting speakers. We have Maxim Matusevich, who is a professor of global history and director of the Russian and East European program at Seton University. We have Alexandra Lamarche, who is the senior advocate for West and Central Africa at Refugees International. And we have John Lechner, who is policy analyst at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. I will introduce each speaker before they speak. So let me just mention a few points about the format for today. Each speaker will give a brief presentation, and that will be followed by a question and answer period. If you have a question, we welcome you to post your question in the Q&A tab on the bottom of the screen. We'll have an interesting conversation after the formal presentations to conclude. And with that, I will not belabor or expand on what our panelists will discuss, but I will now introduce our first speaker. Maxim Matusevich is a professor of global history at Seton University. He is the author of several books. The first is entitled No Easy Row for Russian Ho, Ideology and Pragmatism in Nigerian-Soviet Relations, 1960 to 1991. He is the editor of the volume Africa in Russia, Russia in Africa, 3 Centuries of Encounters. And he has published extensively on several subjects: the history of African-Soviet-Russian encounters, on Soviet anti-racism, and on the history of the African-American presence within the Soviet Union. His most recent article, The Russian Alternative in Sub-Saharan Africa, A Challenge to Western Liberalism, just came out this past year, and I believe it will be posted in the chat. And this article is fantastic. I recommend it to you. It looks at the peculiarity of Russia's post-Soviet return to the continent of Africa in historical perspective. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Maxim.
Thank you so much, Elise. Thank you, Carly. And I would like to express my gratitude to the Harriman Institute, the Institute of African Studies at Columbia, for having us here, this illustrious panel with Alexandra and John. And I've been to numerous events hosted by Harriman Institute. I believe this may be my first time as a panelist, so that's a very special day for me. I'm gonna pull up a poorly designed PowerPoint because I'm not very good at it, but I'll make sure to stay within the time frame. You should be seeing it now. In the last few years, there's been a flurry of articles in the Western media, some of them are very sensationalist kind, about Russia's return to Africa. I believe Time magazine published a leading article about Russia building an empire in Africa. So it's worth looking at what actually is happening on the ground and whether or not such sensationalist approach is actually warranted. And in the process of doing this, I did come across a number of peculiar features of Africa's more recent involvement in Africa on the continent. And for me, as a historian of the Cold War, someone who's done some research on the history of Cold War engagements between the Soviet Union and Africa, it was really fascinating to see that on the one hand, we do have, I'm sorry, I'm trying to move, okay. On the one hand, we do have some continuities between what Russia is doing in Africa right now and the Soviet precedent. At the same time, the situation seems to be vastly different now. Obviously, during the Cold War, Africa played a very important role. It really began in the confrontation between the East and the West, and it became a major battleground, a military battleground in places like Angola or Ethiopia, but also a battleground of ideas, a battleground of competing visions of modernization. What the Soviets had to offer to Africa was their own idea of modernity, which of course was rooted in Marxism-Leninism, development of industrialized base, providing higher education, like you can see here on this propaganda poster, advertising the beauty and benefits of Soviet education to African students. Друга я никогда не забуду, если с ним подружился в Москве, meaning I'll never forget a friend if I met this friend in Moscow. True enough. Very powerful anti-colonial, anti-racist imagery. Very famous propaganda poster, and there were hundreds of similar posters, which were very familiar to the citizens of the Soviet Union and beyond. And they all projected the same idea that the Soviet Union really was a guarantor of African independence. It was decidedly anti-colonialist. It was anti-racist. The anti-racist propaganda campaigns were waged by the Soviets really from the very beginning, from the early 1920s. So this was a very strong claim on occupying high moral ground in this process of negotiating a new world. And in the contest between the United States, its Western allies, and the Soviet Union, obviously here, Nikita Khrushchev, next to Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt at the opening of the Aswan Dam in Egypt, 1964. Here is another poster of Angolan struggle for independence in 1975. MPLA triumphed in Angola, came to power, and Angola really became one of those focal points of the confrontations that would take place in Africa. The regime would declare itself Marxist-Leninist and would be invaded by South Africans in 1975. That would attract Cubans. So Angola would really become one of the flashpoints of those confrontations. What I find interesting and sort of relevant in some ways to what's happening now is the way the Soviets made an effort to connect Soviet experience and Soviet modernization to Africa's aspirations. Here in this cartoon, you can see the Soviet scientific achievement in space playing a peculiar role of a redeemer, redeeming oppressed Africans, redeeming oppressed colonial subjects from the state of oppression. And the idea here, of course, was that the Soviet achievement is the guarantor of Africa's success. Not just Africa, the same would apply to other parts of the developing world. However, we know that all good things come to an end, and the Soviet Union did collapse eventually. And the collapse of the Soviet Union was mirrored by the collapse of Soviet influence in Africa. Africa was abandoned. Here you can see, I believe this comes from Ethiopia, a statue of Lenin being taken off its foundation as a symbolic act of repudiation of Marxism-Leninism. The change began even before the Soviet Union disintegrated. During Perestroika, we can see the change of tone. The Soviet Union is moving closer to still apartheid South Africa towards the end of the 1980s. Soviet commitments in Africa become increasingly suspect, and there is growing sense of nationalism. And I know some of my co-panelists have done some work on this, which tended to see the Soviet Union as the aggrieved side. Too much had been invested into the development of these third world locations, which it was claimed in nationalist rhetoric were ungrateful, and that was presented as one of the explanations of Soviet economic troubles. Here is an image of the Ajayakuta steel mill, a huge white elephant project, which was built in Nigeria with the help of the Soviet Union, never quite completed, which was not that unusual. In the 1990s, the situation changed even more dramatically. In some ways, Africa becomes a symbolic reflection of the state of relationship, not only between Russia, in this case, post-Soviet Russia, and Africa, but also between Russia and the West. And I think there is this kind of interesting dynamic here at play. While Russia in the 1990s was trying to draw closer to the West, emulate the West, seek closer contact with the United States of America, the relationship with African nations was almost non-existent. There was this withdrawal from Africa. I remember visiting the African Institute in Moscow in the 1990s, and it was a desolate place. They were selling trinkets and souvenirs on the first floor. Some research was being done, but a lot of scholars left the country. In the 1920s, with the rise of the oil prices and also the rise of Russian assertiveness on the international stage, we can see the beginning of a reversal. And here we have the conflation of this new nationalism, big business interests, usually those associated with Putin's elites, and the rise of the culture wars in the West. So the question is, what does Russia have to offer Africa? And here is a very incomplete list. The mantra of sovereignty. That is something that really benefits a lot of entrenched local elites. The idea that we do not get involved, that sovereign nations remain sovereign. All of the stuff is very self-serving, by the way, because these ideas particularly rise in the aftermath of the war in Georgia in 2008, and especially events in Ukraine, where the idea of non-interference really benefited Russian foreign policy agenda. The non-strings attached approach to engagement with African elites on the part of Putin elites, that is, we are contracting with you, but we're not going to impose on you demands for human rights, transparency, things like that. Arms and mercenary services in 2019, up to 49% of all arms transfers to the continent originated from Russia or Russian entities. Some trade, it's not all that significant. China, European Union, the United States, trade is much more significant than that conducted by Russia. Some technology transfers, especially in the fields of space exploration, for example, or mineral extraction, but again, fairly limited. Where I think Russia has a lot to offer to Africa is in the field of the critique of the West and Western alleged cultural imperialism. And we can see that this is something that was tested first in Russia as well. The anti-gay legislature, things that really at the time when this first started popping up, people like myself thought were very weird because, it didn't have any seeming relevance to what was happening in the country. However, with time passed, it seems there is a rhyme to this reason. That is, a lot of African elites tend to be conservative, tend to be traditionalist, and tend to feel pushed by the West towards the so-called, let's call it liberal agenda. I'm sure that's that misrepresents what's happening. But the ideas of feminism, gay rights, human rights, election transparency, even climate change. More recently, the ideas of vaccination. All those things that come from the West tend to be looked at with certain suspicion. And instead, Russians argue for the promotion of traditional values, state-sponsored conservatism. So combine that with the idea of sovereignty, combine that with the no strings attached approach to conducting business, no strings attached to ideas of human rights, for example. And you can see how this can become very attractive package for the entrenched elites. Here is an example, the most recent events in Ethiopia, the tragedy of Tigray, the human rights violations committed in Tigray. Within days of the campaign, the Soviet, I think it's Freudian slip, right? Russian ambassador in Addis Ababa communicated to the Ethiopian side that Russia completely recognizes the right of Ethiopia to preserve its integrity. And there is a throwback here, of course, to such things as the Biafra War during the Soviet period, when the Soviets again supported the integrity of federal Nigeria. Here is a personal carrier in the center of Bangui, the capital of Central African Republic, that has very much been in the news, as we know. And again, I would focus not just on the mercenaries activities, which are important, and extraction of minerals, but sort of the soft power cultural outreach, the Soviet cartoons shown on television, but also the staging of Miss Central Africa contest, which would think, a lot of people would think, what's the big deal? And maybe it's not a big deal, but it's really at the time of the Me Too in the West, for example, the time that we talk about things like, gender equality, promotion of this very kind of traditionalist approach to gender roles appears to be also part of the package, as of course the involvement of the mercenary activities. Here you can see apparently Wagner, kind of shadowy organization supplying mercenaries to conflict zones, not just in Central Africa, but also in Syria, in Eastern Ukraine. You can see Russian special forces guarding the president of Central Africa, who's also employed a number of trainers. The exact numbers are in question. I've seen numbers of 400 up to 1,500. It's hard to tell. They probably fluctuate. So what does Africa have to offer Russia? And I'll go quick. I think I have about 7 minutes left. Diplomatic support, especially in the aftermath of Georgia and Ukraine conflicts. We can see that when the United Nations fields resolution condemning Russian behavior, quite often African states either abstain or even vote together with Russia. Improvement to Russia's international image, especially in the contrast to the West and in the context of the sanctions imposed by the West, after Georgia, after Ukraine, and internal developments in Russia. Massive customer base for arms trade, arms transferred. And again, the Soviet precedent is quite important here. It's also interesting that some of the movers and shakers of the Putin regime have a long history in Africa. People like Seton, people like Ivanov, actually worked probably for foreign intelligence during the Soviet times. Ivanov was based in Kenya. Seton was based in Mozambique and Angola later on. So there is this old Soviet connection as well. So business, and that translates into the business opportunities for Putin's elites: minerals, arms, mercenary services. As we've heard in the past few years, with the allegations of Russian interference in the American election, there is a lot of effort to play havoc with the social media in the West. And apparently some of those operations originate in Africa, places like Ghana and Nigeria. In the context of the introduction of sanctions, tourism is actually growing. A lot of more and more Russians travel in Africa. A lot of my friends go there, something they didn't consider doing before. And that seems to be connected to Russia's growing presence there. Obviously, Russian interests involved in extraction of mineral resources. Usually there is this, you can predict, I think, the degree to which Russians would be involved if the civil society is weak, if there is some kind of internal turmoil, like in the case of Central Africa or Central African Republic of Sudan, combined with the presence of mineral resources and the entrenched elites which are willing to contract with Russian businesses. I think that presents a very attractive proposition for Russians to get involved. People like Evgeny Prigozhin, so-called Putin's chief, Power, you've probably seen him before, who's been indicted by the United States Justice Department for his alleged interference in the election campaign in this country. The extrapolation of the internal divisions in Russia, you've probably heard the story, tragic story of the three Russian journalists who, apparently sponsored by Khodorkovsky, were in Central Africa to investigate the presence of Russian mercenaries and were murdered there. And I would like to end with a very quick recapture of what I find of particular interest here, and that's the emergence of this new, very strange postmodern alliance, which seems to shape Russian involvement in Africa. We can see here in this image three individuals. Actually, there are four. One is Putin, but he's not that important here. We can see Alpha Conde, president of Guinea, who I believe was overthrown in a coup d'etat just recently. Then we have a very colorful person, Kemi Seba, of he's French, of Ivorian descent, and Alexander Dugin, who is Eurasianist and Russian nationalist. So what do these people have in common? And what do they have in common? I think they present this kind of thread that runs through Russian activity on the continent now. We have the entrenched elites who are willing to contract with Russians, people like now former President Conde. We have fiery anti-imperialists with a very strong anti-Zionist band, people like Kemi, and he actually was convicted of anti-Semitism in France. And then we have Dugin, who you wouldn't think has much in common with these people. He is, Russian nationalist. He is Eurasianist. Some accused him of proto-fascist sympathies, but actually, what they all have in common is suspicion of the West for their own reasons, and they do present a common anti-Western front. So a very strange alliance between, let's say, radical left anti-imperialists, various kinds of nationalists, monarchists, and the entrenched African elites. And one particular organization, the Association for International Cooperation, AFRIC, founded in St. Petersburg a few years ago, I think is a case in point. It's a very strange organization, which one of its founders is this multimillionaire businessman, Konstantin Malafeyev, who I think actually captures this strange alliance very well. He works closely with Russian-educated African intellectuals. He is an extreme Russian nationalist and a monarchist, engaging anti-Western rhetoric. And he presides over he is engaged in outreach, both to radical left and radical right in Europe. And he is, by the way, one of the guys who apparently bankrolled the most recent strange event in St. Petersburg, the latest imperial wedding in St. Isaac's Cathedral. So the connection between the African anti-imperialists and Russian monarchists, it's very interesting here, right? And it kind of runs contrary to the Soviet precedent. And people like Alexander Malkevich, again, very much involved in the same effort. Someone who is staunchly anti-Americans, create foundation in support of traditional values, and finds himself under US sanctions. And the last image I wanted to share, which also I think captures the bizarre sort of postmodern nature of these new alliances, which define in some ways Russian presence in Africa. Here you can see people, this picture I believe was taken in Madagascar, and two of the individuals on my left is Jose Matumulane, who is a Mozambican professor, Russian educated. Right next to him is Volker Schapke, a founding member of a far-right neo-Prussian German organization. So again, a very strange alliance, both engaged in Africa, both what they have in common apparently is anti-liberal, anti-democratic, anti-Western sentiment. And that's something that in terms of how Russia operates in Africa right now is quite instrumental and useful to the effort. So I would like to end just by saying that the story is complicated. I don't think Russia is creating an empire in Africa. I think that's sensationalist approach to what's happening there. But Africa does present a lot of opportunities to Russia, especially in the context of the growing confrontation with the West. Thank you.
Thank you, Maxim. That was really, really interesting and a quite striking set of images. Now, I would like to introduce our next speaker, who is Alexandra Lamarche. She is a senior advocate for West and Central Africa at Refugees International. Alexandra has led research missions on displacement crises in the Central African Republic, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in Mali and Nigeria, among others. Prior to joining Refugees International in 2017, Alexandra held various positions in the Canadian government and worked on issues of conflict, reconciliation, and migration in the Central African Republic, Chad, Lebanon, Mauritania, Cote d'Ivoire, and Uganda. She holds a master's degree in conflict, security, and development from the University of Sussex in the UK, and a Bachelor of Social Sciences in Conflict Studies and Human Rights from the University of Ottawa in Canada. Alexandra is fluent in both French and English, and she has published several, quite a few interesting articles. And with reference to today's topic, she has published an interesting article in National Interest, which is in the chat. Alexandra.
Thank you so much for having me. Yes, it's a very, as Maxime just said, it's a very complicated story. So I'm happy that we're getting to dive into this a little bit. I will share a presentation as well. Give me one moment. There we go. Can you all see it? Excellent. Here, I'll switch to the next one. When we talk about Russia and Africa, we can be talking about so many different things. We could be talking about arms exports, access to ports and air bases and military cooperation and nuclear deals and access to mines, or we could be talking about media influence. For our purposes here, given the fact that I focus on sort of the consequences of Russia's influence on civilian lives, that's what I'm going to be focusing on, of course. And sorry, just one second. I can't seem to see everything because of these windows. Pardon me. So I will dive into the case of the Central African Republic and then take a step back and then look at what this could mean for Africa more broadly or other countries on the continent. So this is a picture that was recently posted by Fidel Guanjica, who's special advisor to the president, which I'll get into a little bit of the backstory of that later on. One second, there we go. So the Central African Republic is a tiny little country that very few people seem to know about. And the 2013-2014 Central African Civil War, subsequent instability and ongoing humanitarian crisis has largely stayed off the international community's radar until the arrival of the Wagner Group, which Maxime discussed a bit, and I'll dive into that as well. As someone who lived in the Central African Republic prior to the arrival of Russia, it was extremely difficult to sort of work in advocacy and on the humanitarian crisis there when people just had no idea where it was, no idea why it should mean anything to them. So from the humanitarian perspective, the arrival of Russia has been both a blessing and a curse. For those that don't know, the Wagner Group is a Russian private military company whose operations and goals are linked to the Russian military and intelligence community. Unlike its role in Ukraine and Syria, Wagner is not operating with a clear, solely sort of combat mandate, but rather is acting as a security provider, helping train national forces, provide basic material support, protect mining sites, and protect high-level officials. This is a map of different countries where they offer different services. Again, I will just be focusing on the tiny little country in the middle of the continent. So Russia and Wagner in action. In 2017, Russia signed a deal to provide military assistance and training to the Central African government in exchange for mineral concessions. It is important to note that the CAR government, CAR is the acronym for Central African Republic, categorically denies having signed a deal with Wagner, but instead insists on only having signed an agreement with the Russian authorities, which brings us back to that photo that I showed of the presidential advisor. He's wearing that shirt because there's a widespread campaign right now where everyone is claiming to be Wagner because the government is denying that Wagner sort of fully exists or is present in the country. Since Russia's arrival in 2018, pro-Russian campaigns have been everywhere. There have been new radio stations popping up. There are new newspapers, there are billboards everywhere. Russia successfully lobbied for the relaxation of the UN Security Council's arms embargo, encouraged the government to sign a peace deal in 2019, and Russian fighters, along with the Central African forces, Rwandan allies, and the UN peacekeeping mission troops successfully recaptured most of the country's key towns following an uptick in violence in the 2020-2021 elections that just happened about a year ago. So again, this is a complicated story. Not everything is bad and not everything is good. We'll talk about the impact of civilian lives as someone who focused on conflict and displacement as it pertains to civilian populations. Russian fighters and the Wagner Group are being increasingly cited as the cause of forced displacement of communities. This is something that was not the case, about a year and a half ago. This is a very, very new development and extremely worrying. They've been carrying out more vicious attacks on the country's Fulani or Pearl Muslim community, and at times preventing organizations from delivering aid to certain communities and refusing to participate in the standard CivMil coordination practices. And that process is where humanitarian organizations have sort of vague, loose communication with military components to ensure that they can effectively plan their movements, their aid deliveries, and avoid any type of ongoing fighting. Recently, the Century, which is an NGO that does pretty impressive research and it's worth looking into, reported that they have, that Wagner has committed large-scale systematic acts of torture, forced disappearance, extrajudiciary executions and mass killing, pillaging, kidnapping for ransom, and mass rapes. This is a bit of a new development, or the widespreadness of all these issues is extremely concerning and is getting worse and worse. There's now numerous sort of UN reports about this, and it's part of a bit the sensationalist media coverage that already existed is now sort of being proven to be somewhat accurate. On the ground, though, local populations feel different ways. There's an acknowledgement of Russian wrongdoing. People know that they are forcing displacement. They know that they are committing atrocities. They know that they use disproportionate force and have sometimes very ineffective tactics. There's also a lot of disappointment that there is more international attention on Wagner's atrocities compared to the atrocities of armed groups that have been ongoing for, arguably about a decade. There's also a great deal of frustration with the type of material support Russia provides. Outdated military equipment is nothing to write home about. Viewing Russia's presence, however, is also seen as a bit of a cost to, it's unfortunately a very, very large cost, but it's a cost to pay to get rid of armed groups. If you speak to the average Central African, that's what they want. That's why they're frustrated with UN peacekeeping mission, because they're not there to completely fight the armed groups. They're there to keep the peace. And I think that comes with a lot of frustration. So the fact that Russia is there and actually willing to fight the armed groups, people feel that it's an evil to solve another evil, to quote a civil society actor in the Central African Republic. Central African forces need support to fight against them. And the local population increasingly feels like this is the only way that this is going to happen. However, there's a significant schism in local views that has formed over the last year. Many applaud its successes, given the fact that it was able to play a very pivotal role in recapturing territory. But at the same time, with this, increased attacks on Fulani groups and increased displacement and atrocities, there's obviously a different segment of the population that is extremely concerned about their presence and extremely concerned about the influence that they have on the government. There's also the issue of how international narratives and the international reactions in terms of policies have played a negative role in this. As Maxim said, there's a lot of sensationalist coverage, and that has both, some of it proven to be accurate, but some of it also created a bit of a boogeyman situation. Policies, given the great power competition, policies are sort of aimed solely at decreasing Russia's influence in the country, rather than addressing the real issues at the sort of core of a conflict. There's a lot of critiques of governments, whether it be in the Central African Republic or other partners, especially now with the new deal that was just brokered in Mali. There's a great deal of critiques of those governments for partnering with Russia while offering no real viable alternative. The Central African forces genuinely do need hands-on support, and Russia's the only willing partner at this point. And again, as Maxime said, they offer no strings attached deal. It's very, very difficult given the fact that they are willing to they have very, very little or no requirements at all when it comes to human rights. They have no sort of governance requirements. So it makes it a very attractive deal for the Central African forces compared to if they were going to, partner with the American forces or the French. There's a lot more sort of democratic benchmarks that would have to be met for that partnership to actually take place. Speaking of France, we can talk about France's reaction to Russia's presence. Since Wagner arrived in 2018, there's been a significant power struggle with Russia and France over influence in CAR. In June of this year, France cut about 10 million euros in budget support for its former colony and stopped all direct military cooperation, and at some point even removed a lot of its diplomatic staff. This was completely in reaction to Russia's presence there and feeling that they had completely sided with them. The issue is similar to what happened in Mali, where France threatened to remove its military presence and its sort of bilateral assistance if Mali did partner with Wagner, is that France is never coming out the winner of these games of chicken. So I think that there's a real sort of overstating or over expecting that relationship with France with a former colony is more important than what Russia has to offer them. There's also been a great deal of alarm, especially since the uptick in violence last December, surrounding the UN peacekeeping mission's close working relationship with Wagner. Given the fact that this was heavily criticized, MINUSCA has since been forced to sever ties. And I say this a bit lightly, there was still a lot of tension. They don't agree on things, but I think that they have the common enemy of the armed groups. So I think at times they've had to work together, they've had to communicate, and the UN has been very, very upset and very critical of that relationship. This, however, creates a bit of a divide and where it doesn't necessarily need to exist. I think that that's actually complicated the work of the UN peacekeeping mission, where then it doesn't have a good working relationship. It can't know where Wagner's going to go next. It can't sort of have any idea of what they're planning, which makes it really, really difficult in an environment where there are a plethora of armed groups, Central African forces, different, UN peacekeeping contingents. So I'm not quite sure that that's actually going to help the situation of the average civilian Central African person. So more broadly, what does this mean for other countries? Central African Republic is a tiny little sort of microcosm of all these different sort of global dynamics. As Russia and Wagner continue to partner with other African countries with similar complex security environments, we should, of course, be alarmed. I don't want to understate it. Their tactics are absolutely atrocious. And I think that we need to have a very realistic expectation of how that's going to, impact civilian lives, impact humanitarian crises, impact, the human rights track records of national forces. But we need to have a more coherent international approach. In places like Mali or the DRC and other countries still in the grips of protracted security, humanitarian, and governance crises, we can expect similar troubling outcomes for the civilian population and difficult relationship with the peacekeeping missions in those countries. So ways forward. It's a big ask, but I'm constantly sort of speaking with people at Capitol Hill here in DC, and people are always saying, what can we do to counter Russian influence? And do anything. I think that that's the real sort of issue here, is that a lot of these countries, there's a significant lack of engagement from the US, from any other sort of European nation that is coherent, that is effectively addressing the roots of conflict. And it's extremely frustrating for me to sit somewhere where people are far more focused with how they can counter Russian influence instead of how they can actually help people of that country or actually, help it sort of on its path towards peace. I think it's really important to stay away from narratives that undermine the agency of the host governments and absolve them from responsibility. I think that the Central African Republic is a really good example of how people can focus on what Wagner is doing, what Russia is doing, and seem to feel as though the Central African government is not okaying these tactics, is not accepting that level of atrocities. And I think that more responsibility needs to be put on those countries. I think that in terms of any type of foreign policy, civilians must be the top priority of the international community, and that continues to not happen. Sorry, that's not the best grammar, but it's really, really frustrating to see that there's a predominant and overshadowed focus on on security and Russia when these are people's lives. And I think that that's the only way that conflicts really get resolved, is if you give people a viable option. And again, craft policies that address the roots of the conflict and instability, which is usually sort of economic and governance grievances. People just want to have better lives. And I think that that's something that's within the realm of the possible in terms of international policies. And that's it. Let me reopen this if I can find you guys. There we go. Thank you very much. I'll look off to John now.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. That was great. And very sobering. I'm sure we'll discuss it more in a moment. Okay, now I am happy to introduce John Lechner. He is currently a policy analyst for Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Uzbekistan at the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which is a bipartisan federal government advisory body. Prior to joining USCIRF, John spent 7 years as an investment banker, then switched to freelance journalism, covering the history, languages, and politics of Central Africa, Turkey, and the Caucasus, which is a very interesting combination. He speaks Russian, French, Turkish, Georgian, Chechen, German, and Sango. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. Please correct my pronunciation. Which is the lingua franca of the CAR. He's also learning Chadian, Arabic, Armenian, Circassian, and Swan, which is really impressive. He holds an MS degree from Georgetown University's MSFS program and a BA in Slavic languages and literature from Harvard. His bylines include foreign policy, War on the Rocks, Kyiv Post, Africa is a Country, African Arguments, and the National Interest, among others. And you will see one of these pieces, the War on the Rocks piece, in the chat. John?
Thank you. I put that bio down not thinking that it was going to be read out loud. So thank you very much for the extended biography. Alexandra, do you mind stop sharing the presentation? Perfect. So this is a little bit awkward because Alexandra and I often write together, so we didn't think that our presentations were going to look similar, but since we often write together, I think some of this is going to certainly echo what Alexandra said, and also Maxim's excellent presentation. So I'm going to talk about what are the potential drivers for Russian policy in Africa and potential drivers for African policy vis-a-vis Russia, and also what, as kind of Alexandra already stated, what could be or what should be, or even if there should be a response from an American perspective. So the other panelists have touched on this. I want to focus a little bit more on what Maxim has been calling kind of the sensationalist coverage of Russia and Africa, and Alexandra touched on this as well. Here are a couple of recent quotes regarding Russia and Africa. One from the Financial Times, that the Central African Republic is for Wagner a perfect laboratory, or that Russian PMCs are, quote, Putin's private army. And here's also a useful quote from Zakharov, who is tied to Prigozhin and also the national security advisor to President Touadéra, that we were present in many countries during the time of the Soviet Union, and Russia is coming back to the same position. And then finally, recently, the BBC had a recent video about US, China, and Russia competition, calling it, quote, the second scramble for Africa. And I've also included this map, not because it's particularly accurate, and I don't recommend people read the Daily Sabah in Turkey for news per se, but I think it's useful because it shows also how images can create perceptions that Russia somehow is creating, as Maxim said, a new empire in Africa, that a few thousand mercenaries somehow are creating a pincher movement through an entire continent, which obviously, with just the vast size, scope, and diversity of Africa, it would be an absurd notion. and also how multiple, what we call others, come to play within this Russia and Africa narrative. So I think it's worth leaning on Said a bit and his theories surrounding Orientalism and these self-other binaries that force one to see new things, things that we've never seen before as versions of a previous known thing. So perhaps it's unsurprising in those previous quotes that we see Scramble for Africa, a reference to colonialism, the return of the Soviet Union in the Cold War. And also we can often see these concepts that go back a long time, such as Central Africa as anarchic, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, or even the Russian soul and Russian society is somehow impervious to logic, irrational compared to their Western counterparts. And so ultimately, in a strange way, both Russia and Central African societies can become for Western audiences this window to a more primitive past, or that there we can find certain truths about our more basic human nature. Is it Hobbes or is it Locke? And who are we at our core? And then obviously you just have Hollywood as well. Here's a scene from the beginning of a James Bond movie, Casino Royale, where we have a nefarious Eastern European meeting with a Central African warlord in the jungle at the beginning of the movie. And to a certain extent, Wagner and the Central African Republic can play into those types of tropes until you get over there and realize that not too many people have the same chiseled jaws that you find in Hollywood. And why is this ultimately important? Because I think narratives are, if we take a constructivist approach, form the basis of how we define our national interests, and especially how we define the interests or national interests of others, specifically African countries and Russia. And so these two others are coming together to form a phenomenon that it seems like we in DC and perhaps in the West are particularly incapable of analyzing with a clear-eyed view without kind of falling back to prior narratives and experiences. And so those create myths, as Maxim and Alexandra had said about what's driving Russian policy in Africa. So Maxim had already mentioned Russian trade with Africa around 2018, 2019 stood at 20 billion. This is, half of what it was for the United States and is absolutely dwarfed by China. But even within that number, North Africa dominates. So sub-Saharan Africa only accounted for about 4 billion of that trade. So we're still talking about small numbers on a relative basis. But those numbers still span across all different areas, from agriculture to energy and minerals to nuclear power, dams in Egypt, with an special concentration, obviously, on arms exports, as Maxime has already mentioned. And it's important to know that even within those numbers, Algeria represents about 50%. So I think Algerian imports of Russian arms over 2015 to 2019, I believe, were about 4 billion. So that already gives you a sense of how some of these numbers are skewed specifically to North Africa and specifically to Algeria. And why is this important? Similar to the United States, within foreign policy, I think companies have a disproportionate influence compared to, say, domestic politics, where perhaps politicians and governments are more concerned about voter preferences. And so the idea that Russian companies could potentially drive foreign policy in Africa and have influence upon it should not be incredibly surprising. What else is driving Russian policy? We've already talked quite a bit about the military cooperation agreements. Roughly 20 have been signed since 2015. It's interesting to think perhaps what's driving those military cooperation agreements. In my mind, those agreements are more useful in terms of driving arms sales than the other way around. We've already spoken about, we'll talk about PMCs as well, but it's also important to bear in mind what are Russia's security priorities. So it's important to note Russian military doctrine makes no mention of Africa, and geopolitical priorities largely lie elsewhere. As we're speaking right now, I'm sure a lot of people are paying attention to what is going on in Ukraine, and that crisis should give a very good idea of how Moscow chooses to allocate its military resources, which in turn shows what real military and security priorities are. And I think that they will remain for at least the near to medium term around what Moscow considers to be its near abroad. Return to the Middle East. Syria is more of a priority than the Central African Republic. And then kind of going down a ladder of priorities. Political motivations. Obviously, as we've already talked about, there are the interests of the elite and also non-elite, I would throw in there as well. These companies that I showed photos of previously, nuclear energy, arms, hydrocarbon, these are big employers in Russia. Rosneft employs 300,000 people. So yes, there is obviously the need for Igor Seton to feel like he has opportunities, that he places to go where sanctions might not bite as much. But let's also not forget that he actually is at the head of an organization that employs a lot of people, and that is important to any government in terms of domestic policy. Domestic political narratives obviously play a part as well. Putting a metaphorical flag in the Central African Republic gives the image, reifies the concept of державность, that Russia is a great power, that it is returning to great power status. And of course, I think as Maxim mentioned, UN votes can also play a role as well. African countries represent about 1/4 of UN votes, and that can obviously be useful, especially given some of Moscow's other geopolitical priorities. What's driving African countries' policies? First, again, it's important to note neither Russia nor Africa are a monolith. Each country has different drivers for why they would want to partner with Russia. For all the reasons that I've already listed that are driving Russian policies, economics, the same could be said for Africa. It is an opportunity for more trade. It's an opportunity to diversify partners. Russian arms represent a sort of sweet spot in terms of price and technology for many African governments. But I think also more importantly, and we've alluded to this in the presentation, it's worth leaning a bit on the French Africanist Bayard, who noted when it comes to great power competition, and especially during the Cold War, that rather than this sort of culture of dependence, rather than this idea that great powers are simply spreading their influence into a vacuum and local African elite have little agency, it's very often the other way around, and local African elite, local leaders are able to leverage their relationships and resources from the outside, from foreign powers, in order to consolidate their own political domestic power. And I think that is key in terms of understanding what are the drivers for why different governments are partnering with Russia. So as Ali had mentioned before, when we look at CAR, Sudan, and Mali is an especially good case of this currently, extroversion actually provides a very good framework for understanding how instead of great powers simply going in, locals draw in great powers in order to actually achieve the political outcomes domestically that they are seeking. And so when Touadéra in the Central African Republic was first inviting in Wagner Group, he was very afraid at that time, after French and American withdrawal from the country, that there was going to be a potential coup. And so Wagner seemed like a great political option in order to shore up his own domestic security and political support. Same case with Sudan, when al-Bashir in around 2017 felt that he was losing domestic political support, that the United States was, in his own mind, meddling. He reached out to Russia about the potential of building a port in order to balance the two off of each other. And Mali currently, I think, is a great example of a regime right now that is dealing with issues of legitimacy following a coup and seeking to play powers off of each other in order to extract as much political benefit and potentially little criticism about delaying future elections going forward. So there is a lot of agency, as Ali had remarked previously, regarding local African elite when it comes to Russia and Africa. And that's why we often see the same faces around, despite the Cold War, the war on terror, and as we go into what many consider to be, a new round of great power competition, U.S. versus China, the same local faces are still around, as we saw with the former president of Zaire, Mobutu, here with Kennedy, and then with Reagan. There's a reason that these guys are still always the same guys. They are good at tapping into what the international discourse is and leveraging that to their benefit. And that is why this Russia and Africa narrative is gaining some traction. So how do we dispel some of these myths? Who's really in charge? I mean, the answer is both everyone and therefore no one, I think. We have to focus and ground our analysis always in local agency and domestic politics to understand what's driving Russia's partnerships in Africa, or at least we have to make sure that that is a serious consideration. So is a country like the Central African Republic a laboratory for Wagner? Absolutely not, for all of the reasons that Ali has listed already. CAR is going through decades of insecurity, at least a decade of serious conflict with overlapping identities, armed groups, a war economy, so many different layers. And the idea that that a couple of, or not a couple, but that mercenaries can come in and be in absolute control, can take full agency over the situation at the expense of others in an area that is just as complex as conflict in Syria, Afghanistan, Congo, or others, really undermines a lot of what's actually going on in the Central African Republic. Are we seeing individual or state interests? I think it's a combination of both, and it depends. I think, as Maxim had said earlier, how Russian PMCs operate in Ukraine and Syria is going to be different than how they operate in CAR, because state interest is very different. And so what it seems to be the case in CAR is that the PMCs are financed through potentially mineral extractions, or potentially paid as well by the government. But that shouldn't be a sign of a state relationship. That's actually a sign that these guys have to fund themselves and figure it out themselves. If the Central African Republic was a priority for the Kremlin, or quote unquote Putin is thinking about the Central African Republic, you would think that they would be able to get some funding outside of trying to make money off of diamond mines in one of the worst humanitarian conflicts in the world. And so what's driving also politics or profit, the desire for Russian influence to expand until it can't expand anymore? Or is it lining the pockets of the folks who are running the PMCs? I think that these PMCs have to operate within narratives and within discourse that are provided. The Kremlin provides bookends in terms of what are the possibilities within Russian foreign policy, in the same way that the US provides bookends as well. Blackwater, or what was formerly Blackwater, can do a lot, but one thing that they can't do is go and probably take a contract with the Chinese government. There's no written rule there, but it would break kind of a norm around what they should be allowed to do, and would elicit a response. So I think these groups reify narratives around Russian foreign policy, but we shouldn't exoticize as well what mercenaries do. They're already exotic enough. the idea that they are showing up in conflict zones should not be surprising, given that that is the primary market for mercenaries. And they will go around and try to drum up business where they can. It says nothing about what Ali has described in terms of methods or anything along those lines, but whether or not they wind up in Mali, I think it's important to note that there's also, a profit reason for why they're there. It's a viable market for them. So if there's no clear Russian policy that is driving Russia's quote unquote return to Africa, should there be a response, or how, from an American perspective, should we respond? And Ali and I overlap quite a bit here. First and foremost, avoid Cold War and colonial narratives. As Maxim said, there are some similarities, but on the whole, Russia's return is different than the Soviet Union. And we should focus also on our own internal contradictions when it comes to Africa policy. We often criticize Russia and especially China for upholding autocracies on the continent, undermining democracy, but our own, especially with regards to the war on terror, the US can certainly be accused of doing similar things at different times as well, also in Africa. Focus less on security. The US policy in Africa is usually over-securitized, and instead focus on basic things like increasing trade, supporting small, medium businesses, supporting local journalists who are reporting on these issues, cultural exchanges. And as Ali already mentioned, in places like the Central African Republic, focus on what drives conflict, not on Wagner, because ultimately mercenaries are a product of conflict. They are not the reason that conflict began. And at some point, these mercenaries will likely not be in the Central African Republic, but a lot of the armed groups, a lot of the issues that still remain there will obviously continue. And then finally, focus on diplomacy and actually show that you care. I think in September, Zambian President Hichilema visited Washington, D.C. and was only able to get a meeting with the vice president, not with Biden. That wouldn't happen in China, probably wouldn't happen in Russia either. And so, and these things get noticed. And I'll just end as well on vaccine equity, because these are also things that get noticed. Punishing South Africa for discovering this variant, immediately closing borders to South African countries is not the way, in terms of narrative or foreign policy in general, that you're going to be able to lure African governments or African citizens, more importantly, away from Russia or China, if that's what you're hoping to do. So I will stop there. Hopefully I didn't run too much over. And thank you all very much.
Great. Thank you, John. A lot of material here to think about. And I see we have some questions in the chat. I will just kick it off by saying there's many points of commonality in terms of all of our speakers. Focus on the disparate motivations of first identification of various actors rather than just Russian government's kind of interventions in Africa, and the disparate motivations of the various actors, which makes some of the questions a little bit maybe harder to answer, or rather some of the questions harder to pose in a really broad way. But let me just try to combine one question I had with the first question I see in the Q&A. I wanted to just ask, I'll ask everyone, although I initially thought of this as a question for Maxime, when you kind of mentioned specifically about Russia offering Africa a critique of Western liberalism and of cultural imperialism. I was just wondering if you have in mind a sort of the kind of soft power model that Russia offers, or is it, are you observing specific Russian messaging through, the mouths of particular actors, or through kind of organized campaigns on media in terms of, we're not going to be pushing a feminist agenda, or we're not going to be pushing a gay rights agenda, or did you have in mind just kind of like Russia, by virtue of its hands-off approach, offers a kind of soft power model to African countries? And I think this might be combined with the first question by Rajani Mahanti, which was, how would you compare Russia's role versus China's role in Africa? Could we say that Russia is fighting more for the mind of Africa and China is fighting more for its body? So I don't know, Maxim, maybe you want to start, and the other panelists can also offer any thoughts they have if they want.
Sure. Thanks so much, Elise, and thank you for the question in the Q&A. I think both. I think the message that Russia beams into Africa is that of non-interference, of your sovereignty is your sovereignty, none of our business. But it also articulates those ideas in far more specific terms. For example, we see in Central Africa, they sponsor beauty pageants, which has a very particular cultural message, especially when you put those events against the background of, let's say, the Me Too movement happening in the West. The Sochi summit was quite interesting in 2019. If you read some of the documents presented, a lot of them kind of insipid, it's just standard fare, no more cooperation, more agreements. But there are some documents on cultural exchanges, and those seem to emphasize the importance of the so-called African identity, meaning traditional values, also importance of Pan-Africanism, which is very strange, and also a departure from the Soviet precedent, because the Soviets were not big on Pan-Africanism. They looked at it with suspicion. But here, all of a sudden, we have the promotion of those ideas. In Uganda, and again, I would, that's something I read somewhere, trying to remember where, but there was, Uganda, as you know, became a flashpoint of anti-gay legislature a few years ago, which also attracted a lot of American evangelicals. And apparently on the ground, there was some kind of collaboration between, the Russian envoys of Russian traditionalism and the envoys of American fundamentalism, Christianity, which is kind of an interesting development. In Ethiopia, there are a lot of church-to-church exchanges. And if you read the documents of the latest meeting between the Ethiopian church representatives and the patriarch, they emphasize the importance of traditional values. They're very, very explicit talking about it. And again, I would draw attention to the personalities involved in those efforts. The people who are involved on the Russian side quite often are ardent Russian nationalists, people who literally create organizations in support of traditional values and with very, open anti-LGBTQ plus agenda. The Eurasianists. So it's a very interesting development. And the question, I think it's a very poetic way to present it, whether Russians appealing to the soul, again, the Russian soul, I think that's something along the lines that John talked about this whole discourse, and the Chinese appeal to the body. I don't know, but it seems that Russia is more directly involved in a kind of in a rhetorical conversation with the United States. And with the, it's interesting that during the BLM protests last summer, how Russian establishment really felt compelled to speak up on this issue. And Sergei Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, went on record saying, being very disdainful of BLM, but at the same time arguing that we have the right to be disdainful because we don't have that sin. We don't have the chip on our shoulders. We never engaged in colonialism. Of course they did. Not in Africa. We didn't practice Jim Crow. So for us, this is a non-issue. And that's how they criticize, I think, some of the progressive agenda in the West by presenting Russia as a special case. Someone who doesn't bear the sins of the West, and therefore they don't have to succumb to political correctness. They don't have to succumb to progressive rhetoric. They're doing their own thing, and I think that sells even in parts of Africa. Just one quick comment. not to take too much time. At the time of the Sochi summit, I found it very interesting that the largest tabloid in Russia, Moskovsky Komsomolets, published a very bizarre story, as tabloids would do, on the summit, which was very racist. It was just articulated in such a racist language, which was bizarre because we know that the newspaper is actually very close to the Kremlin. And the question is, why would they indulge in this? Is there no communication between the editor of the newspaper, who actually is Putin's confidant, and what they published at the time when all these African leaders of heads of states coming to Russia and publishing? This would have been a great scandal anywhere in the West. And I thought that maybe the point is exactly that we can do that because we're not like the West. We're different. We don't have that baggage, basically. So.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. John or Alexandra, do you want to weigh in on this or wait for another question?
I think on the Russia versus China, I think it's difficult to compare because we really, in a way, we can't even compare the level of Russian engagement to the level of Chinese engagement. I mean, Chinese engagement is on such a vaster scale economically and infrastructure wise. I mean, so I can't imagine if we're comparing with the implication that somehow they should be competing with each other or that it's a competition, then I don't think that Russia has anything to offer really in comparison, other than, as Maxim said, for certain folks who are I think more along those traditionalist lines. And I like that he brought up the evangelicals as well, because it is worth noting that a lot of these issues as well come, there are certainly a lot of these kind of anti-gay, abortion type of issues actually have come over from Protestant missionaries as well, that then become also a part of the discourse. So as we saw with the trade numbers, I mean, there's really no comparison in terms of economics versus what they're offering, and I think even compared to the United States.
So that's probably your answer to James Francis's question as well, in regards to commercial diplomacy. Has Russia learned anything from China? If so, is this strategy sustainable in cultivating economic growth? If not, why has Russia forged its own path? Or do you have any kind of more specific answer with regard to commercial diplomacy?
It's interesting because I think some of the narratives around Russia in Africa are like the little brother version of China in Africa, that China is somehow also a neo-colonial actor who's essentially engaged in kind of creating a new empire on the continent. Whereas the same with Russia, that a lot of this is not state mandated. A lot of this is very hyper local. The investment is hyper local, and so I don't think that I don't think that there's any specific type of Chinese commercial venture in Africa. It can vary from state investment on a grand scale to mom and pop shops setting up little manufacturing departments in villages. So again, I don't think that there's really a pattern that we can take away from there that Russia somehow would want to differentiate itself from. But I would leave it up to maybe Maxim and Alexandra to comment on that.
Let me turn to Alexandra. There's a question here for her from Tatiana Smirnova. What do you think about possible scenarios in Mali regarding the Wagner narrative?
In terms of the narrative, I think we're going to see a very similar narrative that we saw and we're currently seeing unfold in the Central African Republic. I think that there will be a a game of chicken, and I think similar to what happened in CAR, which is that the government, I think at the onset of their partnership, thought that they could create a bidding war and thought that they could get more out of France or more out of European partners or more out of the US because of that fear that exists among those partners that Russia was present. And I think Mali might be thinking the same thing, and I don't think it's going to work out in their favor. And I think on the humanitarian side, I think it's going to be exactly what we've seen in the Central African Republic. I think we're going to see increased attacks on minority groups. So in CAR, that's the Fulani. There's also a pretty significant Fulani community in Mali. There's also other minority groups as well, which, given that nationalist sort of ideology, I think could be really, really troublesome. And I think that a lot of Mali's problems stem from the fact that the government fails to provide or recognize the needs of people who are a bit more rural, who tend to be part of minority groups. So I think that we will only see sort of the roots of conflict become more entrenched. I think that we will see similar, human rights abuses and increased atrocities. We'll see more and more displacement, which in Mali right now, I think Mali sort of fell off the radar because it had been so protracted and going on for so long, but there's been a steady increase in displacement and spreading violence and displacement in areas that used to be relatively stable. So I think that this is not gonna, it doesn't bode well, I don't think. I think that we're gonna see very, very similar dynamics in terms of the UN peacekeeping mission in Mali to what we see in terms of their relationship in the Central African Republic. So I have unfortunately little hope to spread. I'm pretty concerned about it. But again, all of these partnerships stem from a pretty significant neglect from other partners. And I think we have to acknowledge that. And we're not offering any type of viable alternative. We're not actually offering them help. And even to look at the sort of no strings attached model, one of Central African Republic's more traditional partners offered them trucks, but they had to sort of, for every truck that they gave them, they had to show that someone had passed a driver's test. And they just said, well, why would we do that? Like, Russia's going to give us trucks and we don't have to do anything for them. Like, the bar is so low at times that it becomes really, really hard for countries that have more of a bit of a more, substantive bureaucratic sort of world to actually partner with them and require certain things or benchmarks in return. So I'm concerned, and we'll see what happens. But regardless, Mali is on a downward trajectory, and I think that this is only going to worsen it.
Thank you. Let me take a question from Anonymous. Kind of provocative question. The subtext of Professor Matusevich seems to simplify Russia's involvement in Africa in a binary moralistic good and bad, a framework that assumes the West has everything good to offer to Africa and the world, but Russia's involvement is essentially evil. Am I correct? And part two, what sets this academic narrative different from the narrative that's offered by the popular press?
Thank you. Well, I hope that's not the impression I'm leaving listeners with. Maybe the format is to abbreviate it, to account for the nuance. I think, as John Alexandra mentioned, the situation is complicated. There is a lot of nuance there, and the focus, of course, of this panel is Russia. But we can talk for a very long time about everything that the West is doing and has done, and historically did wrong in Africa, and that's something that I cover extensively in the courses I teach. For example, we can talk about the unholy alliances that I think John referred to between the United States and Mobutu, and the support for the apartheid South Africa. Not everything the Soviet Union did in Africa was evil. They supported liberation movements. They were staunchly anti-apartheid. It's a very complicated story indeed. Since we are focusing on what Russia is doing now, I think the important point is the one that Alexander just made about the Western neglect of the continent, the absence. In 2009, I think that's a very interesting moment when President Obama came to Africa, and he gave that beautiful speech, as he always did, in Ghana, simultaneously with him, and then he went back home. Simultaneously with him, Dmitry Medvedev, who at the time was a placeholder president, toured the continent with an entourage of 400 business people. And he went to multiple countries and signed contracts. And that's the difference. There is a void that Russia is feeling, and I think Alexandra and John made this point so very well. I have to say that when you look at the individual actors on the Russian side who are in charge of this project, people like Prigozhin, people like Seton, these are not pleasant characters, these are problematic individuals, and they push forth problematic policies. They're also those who tend to preside over the suppression of the opposition within Russia. So I think there is plenty of blame to go around. It's absolutely not the case of evil Russia against good West, not at all. But we're focusing on what Russia is doing right now, and hence maybe, the impression I left the listener with, which was not my intention.
Okay. And I just think it's worth noting that we need to, as Maxim did in his presentation, and Alexandra mentioned with France, we need to ground how Russia is viewed within the context of colonialism and neocolonialism. And so it is not, there's a lot of ideas going around now that anti-French attitudes in the Sahel and the Central African Republic are somehow the product of disinformation or manipulation, sometimes even by Russia. There's no need for disinformation or manipulation to create anti-French, anti-colonial attitudes in these countries. And that is specifically because colonialism was brutal, extractive, highly unequal, came with so much incredible psychological trauma. And it wasn't that long ago. So, I'm in my 30s, my father's in his mid 60s. That means that in the Central African Republic, he experienced French colonialism when there were a total of 6 schools in the country under French rule. And so when we think about these things in terms of generations, it shouldn't, and really that it was only one generation ago, or people still remember it, it should kind of change our perspective in terms of how people view the Soviet Union in terms of liberation struggles. And that they don't have the same type of baggage or the same views about Russia that someone in Washington, D.C. has, especially recently.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for bringing in that generational point. Students who are so young sometimes often forget to think about the lived experience of people of various generations on the ground. Let me turn to a question by Natasha Gray. What do officers in the CAR Army want from the Wagner Group? How big is the CAR Army and how large is the officer corps? Alexandra, do you want to take that one?
I can answer part of it. It is I think it's about 7,000 active military. I don't know how many of those are officers. It's pretty small. What they want from Wagner is training and material goods. I think that the interesting thing that Wagner offers that other countries don't is that they deploy with the Central African forces. They are on the ground with them, whereas sort of other partners like the UN, the EU training mission sort of trains them and then sends them off. But I think that they really, really like that hands-on support. And it's a big, seeing the Central Africans redeploy across the country was a really, really important and proud moment for a lot of Central Africans after the war. And it's a very important thing. And I think the fact that that was accompanied, in a very active way by Wagner was something that actually had a lot of positive impacts on the narrative around it. So what they want from them is something that no one else is offering them. So that's an important point, but it is relatively small.
And I would just add that, again, from kind of the local perspective, as Ali mentioned, after the Civil War, with armed groups controlling various territory, the government really only controlled the capital, Bangui. And so the reasons for these partnerships follow a very clear internal logic. And if you speak to a lot of Central Africans, they'll say, how can we develop economically? How can we move forward if the government only controls Bangui? That's not where the country's only real main resources are, which happen to be minerals and other things. And so there is a very kind of simple logic behind why the government and why for many Central Africans territorial integrity is so important. And why Wagner was really offering something that others were not, which was not a chance at regaining the country.
And with the help of Wagner, the government has actually regained more territory than it has had in the past 20 years. Like there's a really significant shift that is very attributable to their presence and peace and Rwanda, but they play a big part in it.
And again, yeah, I was in Bangui in January when a new rebel alliance had formed together and was marching on Bangui. And if it wasn't for Wagner, Rwandan bilateral forces, they would have overthrown the government and replaced it with something much worse. And I think people actually recognize that fact. And despite all of the baggage that comes along with Wagner, I think most people would still prefer them to France. And so that should tell you quite a bit about what people think about France, and it's all justified, to put it shortly.
Thank you. Let me turn to a pair of questions by Susan Hoyman. She says, again, about China. The first question is there evidence of Chinese military and mercenary activity in Africa? And the second question picks up on this point about commercial competition with Russia, or infrastructure building competition, since she said she stayed with a Chinese road team camp in Zambia for a few days and observed Chinese involvement in building roads and railroads. Are we overlooking the possibility that the Russians are beginning to compete with the Chinese as well as with the West in terms of infrastructure?
I would say probably not. On the last question, I mean, there are, Gazprom is obviously very involved in Algeria, Rosneft in Mozambique, Tatneft in Libya, I believe, and there are big Russian mineral or diamond companies like Alrosa, which is in Angola. I mean, there are significant infrastructure projects. I think probably similar to how China first, especially the hydrocarbon industry, first became involved in Africa. It was a product of the fact that other major multinational corporations were not interested in the places that China could actually compete in. These were areas like Sudan, which at the time was still a combined entity with South Sudan, where there are heavy sanctions, just a really poor operating environment. And that's where these Chinese oil companies cut their teeth. And my guess would be is that to a similar degree, what these Russian companies are offering is not really competitive with large multinationals. And so they're kind of in the markets that they're in, partially because of sanctions on Russia itself, but also partially because of what their own kind of technical abilities are. With regards to Chinese mercenaries in security, I think the answer is no. I think we've seen some Chinese security in terms of like private security around different Chinese assets, say in around kind of oil fields or something along those lines, but really nothing significant. There is some interesting developments that China has really been upping its participation in UN peacekeeping missions, I think especially in Mali. But that participation is very great, necessary, but it's largely still confined to kind of a support role instead of even more forward. So China sends doctors, they send people who kind of tend to, if anybody gets wounded, the backup infrastructure, but they're not really participating in kind of contact missions that would contact kind of an enemy or hostile entity.
Let me read a question from Tom Kent, who's an adjunct professor here and also the author of a recent book on how the West should counter Russian disinformation. In South Africa, Russia has had very good ties with Jacob Zuma, who was president until he resigned in 2018. Zuma also took strong anti-Western positions. What's your assessment of the foreign policy of the government that has replaced him, led by Cyril Ramaphosa? How does it compare to Zuma's in terms of its relationship with Russia and Western countries? Does anybody want to take that on?
Well, I can say just a few things.
Okay.
Not really an expert, but I think we see here the departure of the old guard, the ANC, and many of those historically had very close ties with the Soviet Union, either trained there or had personal connections. The younger generation is a little bit different, and it seems that with the development of the civil society in South Africa and the civil society becoming younger, Russians might start running into problems because, there was, for example, this conference hosted by the Russian embassy in South Africa just before, I think it happened before the Sochi summit. And they did run into some challenges coming from the guests, many of them younger people, people who questioned what they saw as corrupt relationship between the established entrenched ANC elites and the old Russian friends. So again, I don't want to make too much out of it, but it seems that, and also the new government, I think, stopped developing the nuclear agreement that had been signed by the previous one. So that might be a manifestation of some of the problems they can run into in the future. But I'll probably leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Time is getting short, so let me conclude with a last question about COVID. Is Russia helping Africa with vaccines? John, I think you mentioned, you were mentioning as policy prescription that there should be more assistance with vaccines to Africa, but is Russia promoting its vaccine in Africa? Does anyone know?
It is in certain places, but I do not think that it is really on a scale that I've noticed. I don't know if the others. So I think that they have, donated some vaccines in the Central African Republic, but I think there have been large issues around Russian vaccine distribution worldwide. So I wouldn't be surprised if those same issues kind of face African countries as well. But I would, maybe Maxim or Alexandra would have a better idea on that.
All I know is that it offered the AU, the African Union, about, I don't know, a couple 100 million vaccine doses earlier this year, and I know very little about if it's panned out. So I'm here to offer incomplete information.
And I don't really know much on the subject. Thankfully, for now, much of sub-Saharan Africa was not impacted as severely by COVID as some other parts of the world. But beyond that, I'm not sure how that develops.
Okay, well, thank you. You have been very gracious in sharing your time with us today. The panel's gone on a few minutes longer than typical, but this has been a great conversation with a wide-ranging set of questions. So I really want to thank each of our panelists for sharing their expertise with us. And I also want to thank everyone who attended and those of you who posed questions that were really quite broad. And I really thought this was a great discussion. So thanks to everyone once again. And let's keep up on the issues.
Thank you so much. And let's keep in touch.
Yeah, definitely.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Too.